So, good evening, and welcome to the first of two videos on the respiratory system. Now, in chapter 5 and 6, we talked about the cardiovascular system and how it was responsible for distributing materials such as nutrients, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and metabolic wastes from various parts of the body to other parts of the body. When we talked about the digestive system in the last chapter, we talked about how nutrients are carried by the blood from the small intestine to the liver and then eventually distributed throughout all of the cells of the body. Well, the respiratory system is works along with the cardiovascular system in much the same way. Of course, now we're talking about the respiratory gases that need to be distributed from the lungs to all the cells, and then from the cells back to all of the lungs. All right, our cells require oxygen for metabolism, and we have to get rid of carbon dioxide, and so we need a point for getting these gases exchanged. And that point is the respiratory system, working, of course, in conjunction with the cardiovascular system. So, this is a map, essentially, of what the respiratory system actually looks like. And notice that at least up front, or up top here, the system consists of many of the same parts as the digestive system is composed of. However, we're going to concentrate here on the respiratory system and what its function actually is. Now, the upper respiratory tract is the area up here on the top, and it's composed of the nasal cavity, the pharynx, the glottis, and the larynx. And we'll get into each of their functions in just a moment or so. The lower respiratory system consists of the trachea or the windpipe, and then the bronchus, which are these two branches that come off of the trachea. The smaller branches are called bronchioles, and then they end up in the tissue that we refer to as the lungs. Okay. One other thing that I do want to point out to you is this big muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. This is called the diaphragm, and it is a voluntary muscle that actually helps us to breathe. Okay, so what constitutes the upper respiratory tract? Well, there are three major portions of this here. All right. First is the nose. All right. And you can see the nose right here. This is the outside of the body. And the nostril or the nares it are the two openings at the bottom of your nose that allow air in and out. Notice that the air is drawn into a very large cavity in your skull. And this is referred to as the nasal cavity. The air then passes down the nasopharynx, which is the part of the pharynx behind the nose, through the oropharynx, which is the part of the pharynx behind the mouth, and then down through the laryngopharynx, which is the part of the pharynx that is behind the voice box or the larynx. Okay, so those are the major portions here. Remember from the previous talk about the digestive system, we've also got the epiglottis, which is this flap of connective tissue that closes the opening to the trachea, which is found right here, and called the glottis. Just below that is the larynx or the voice box. Okay. So what happens in the nose, and what's the purpose of the nose? Let me move my ugly mug out of the way here. I'm going to put myself up here. So the nose, of course, opens to the outside world at the nostrils or the nares, and it leads into the nasal cavities, which are these areas up here. Okay. Now, there is hair and mucus in the nose that's designed to filter the air that you breathe in. All right. if you have ever been outside on a dusty day, or if you've mowed the lawn or worked with something that is very, very dusty, and you didn't put a mask on, you may notice that you're blowing, colored snot out for the next 6 to 12 hours, depending upon how bad it is. Happens to me all the time when I mow my lawn, because I've got these patches of that are just dried dirt and dust, especially when it hasn't rained for a while. And the hair and the mucus in the nose filter out all of that junk before it ends up in your lungs. Now, inside the nasal cavity, there are lots and lots of capillaries, and the capillaries contain warm blood. And so the point of those capillaries is to warm up the air that you're breathing in and moisten it as well. This is not so important in warm weather, but when it's 10 degrees out and you're breathing in all of that very, very cold air, you don't want 10-degree air to make it all the way down to your lungs, because you could damage the tissues, the very delicate tissues in your lungs at that point. Now, although we're not going to spend much time talking about it now, at this point, right up here, are specialized cells that act as odor receptors. All right, we'll talk about that much more when we get to the nervous system and the various senses. One of which, of course, is the sense of smell, but that does occur in the nose, so we should mention it here. And then finally, there are tear glands that run into the nasal cavities that can lead to a runny nose. Interestingly enough, the tears that come out of your eyes and the clear snot that runs out of your nose, if you've got a runny nose, or if you've got a little kid with a runny nose, it's the same fluid, exactly the same. Now, I'm not talking about the big green boogers, all right? That is an indication of some sort of an infection, or that sort of thing. But the clear tears are actually that, and the clear snot that comes out of your nose, those are actually the same thing. So there's tear glands actually inside the nasal cavity. Now, the pharynx, and we already said that there are three different portions of it, but the pharynx is essentially a cavity at the back of the head and down through the neck that is commonly called the throat. All right. There are three portions of it based on location. All right. The portion of it that's behind the nose is called the nasopharynx. The portion behind the mouth is called the oropharynx, for oral. And the portion behind the voice box is called, or the larynx is called, the laryngopharynx. All right, and you can see them outlined over here on the right hand side. So you've got the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and then the laryngopharynx here. Just as a little side note, you can see the tonsils both at the back of the throat here, but also at the back of the nasal cavity here. All right, and these tonsils are part of the lymphatic system, and they filter out dirt, dust, germs, bacteria, and anything else in the air that we breathe and in the food that we eat. Now, the larynx is found at the very bottom of the pharynx, and this is also known as the voice box. Now, the picture on the right-hand side is an actual photograph, and then, of course, there's a drawing on the right-hand side. This is the base of the tongue. You can see it here. And so what that means is, at this point, you're looking at the top of the skull. As you look into the screen, you're looking from the top of the skull down into the voice box, all right? And so the person's nose would be here, and the back of the head would be somewhere back here. All right. Notice that there are, it's a triangular shaped area that allows air to pass between the pharynx and the windpipe, or the trachea. All right. And it's oftentimes referred to as the voice box because it houses the vocal cords. And you can see this is one of the vocal cords, and this is the other. Now, there are also two folds of connective tissue that you can see in here and in here that vibrate and help to produce the sound. Now, the vocal cords themselves function much like the strings on a guitar or a violin or even a piano. All right, the way that a stringed instrument works is you change the length and the tension in those strings, and you can produce different sounds. Um, and you can change the pitch of your voice from very deep to very high. All right, if you really want to tighten your vocal cords, you can sound very, very or make words with a very high pitched voice, right? Like Elmo is your friend, right? Or something like that. Or you can be a munchkin from The Wizard of Oz. On the other hand, if you let them relax and uh, just kind of loosen up, you can make a very deep pitched sound. So Obi-Wan never told you what happened to your father. All right. And so James Earl Jones, or the voice of Darth Vader, obviously has very large vocal cords that he loosens up to produce that timbre in his voice. Whereas the guy who's doing the voice of the Muppet Elmo, I'm not really sure how he can do that for any length of time without hurting himself or herself. I'm not really sure. In any event, it's the same thing with the guitar, right? If you're playing a guitar and I'm trying to, you're right, you move your hand up and down the fret, I think it's called. I don't play the guitar, so I don't really know. But as you move your hand down closer, you're decreasing the length of the string. And what that essentially does is it changes the wavelength and therefore the pitch of the sound that you're producing. Well, you do exactly the same thing with your vocal cords. You make them um, looser or tighter, longer or shorter, and that changes the pitch of your voice. Now, people who are singers who have a wide range can do amazing things. Whitney Houston and who's the woman? I can't think of her. Mariah Carey. They have incredible voices that can range from very high notes to very low notes, and they do this by manipulating the length of their vocal cords. Okay, so what is the second portion of the respiratory tract? Well, this consists of the trachea, the bronchial tree, and the lungs. Now, you can see them labeled here. This is the trachea. There are two bronchi, which then branch off into smaller bronchioles, which then branch off into even smaller bronchioles, and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. All right, and those eventually end up in the tissue that we refer to as the lungs. Okay. So the trachea, the bronchial tree, and the lungs constitute the lower respiratory tract. Now, the trachea is a tube, all right, often called the windpipe, and it connects the larynx, your voice box, with the primary bronchi, the two branches that lead into each individual lung. It's made of connective tissue, smooth muscle, and rings of cartilage that help to keep it open. All right, and so the rings of cartilage are, if you ever make the OK sign, all right, it's about that big, depending on how, well, I guess it depends on how big your hands are, but about that size. And so, that's a lot of volume of air that you can bring in and push out in or with each of your breaths. But it has to be kept open at all times. If that trachea was to collapse, that would make it much more difficult to breathe. And so they're held open by these rings of cartilage, and they're spaced apart. You know, Maybe half an inch apart each, and they run from the base of your larynx all the way down into the bronchi. Now, interestingly enough, the trachea is lined with small hair-like organelles. So these are projections of cell membranes, all right, that reach out into the tube. And those cilia actually help to move dust and mucus and other stuff back up to the top. And these cells that you see here are called goblet cells. All right. The goblet cells produce mucus. And so, when you cough, or especially when you're sick, you cough up mucus. All right, and you do this all the time, all day, every day, whether you realize it or not. The mucus is coming up, and you swallow the vast majority of it, 99.9% of it. All right, you may hawk a loogie once in a while, but that mucus comes up, and generally speaking, you swallow it to get rid of it. But the function of the mucus is to trap dust and dirt and other particles, and the function of the cilia is to keep sweeping it back upward and out of the lungs, because the lungs are essentially just sacs that sit in your chest. All right, and so if they get filled up, it's over. Right, you got to get all that stuff back up and out. All right, so lined with cilia and mucus that help to keep the lungs clean. Now, the bronchial tree, if you can imagine this, take the trachea here, and then take the whole picture and uh, turn it 180 degrees. If you look at the trachea as the base of, uh, come on, the base of a tree trunk, you can see the branches leading off of the tree trunk. And so it looks like an upside down tree. And so we refer to it as the bronchial tree. Now, there are two main bronchi, one here and one here, that lead into each individual lung. The bronchi, as I illustrated earlier, continue to branch until they become small bronchioles about 1 millimeter in diameter. Now, 1 millimeter is about the size of a period in your textbook. All right, so read a sentence in your textbook. When you come to the end, the period of the end, that's about 1 millimeter in diameter. So the bronchi continue to branch into smaller and smaller and smaller tubes until the very end of those tubes is about 1 millimeter in diameter. Now, those smallest of bronchioles end up in sacs, which we call alveoli. And the alveoli is where the actual exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide takes place. Okay. Now, just for anatomy's sake, anything beyond the trachea is part of the lung. So the two bronchi are part of the lungs, all the bronchioles are part of the lungs, and the alveoli are part of the lungs. Now, just as a little piece of trivia that you can take to your next cocktail party, your right lung has 3 lobes. You can see the divisions here and here, and the left lung only has 2 lobes. So you are not bilaterally symmetrical when it comes to your lungs. And each of the lungs is enclosed in its own little sac called a pleura. Okay. Now, so this is an image of one bronchiole. And again, this tube here that is circled there, or running this way, is 1 millimeter in diameter. And at the end of these are a bunch of little sacs called alveoli. And you have about 300 million alveoli in your lungs, all right? And their function is, of course, to increase the amount of surface area so that diffusion can occur more efficiently, all right? Now, we have 3 different versions of the alveoli that I want you to see here. So here's the end of one of the tiniest bronchioles, and here is a sac of alveoli that is cut open. And you can see that there's bunches and bunches of little chambers in here. And each of those chambers is providing surface area for the diffusion of oxygen into the blood and carbon dioxide out of the blood. This one shows the alveoli uncut, and then this one shows the alveoli with the capillary beds surrounding them. Now, in reality, of course, all of them have capillary beds surrounding them. This is just an illustration to help you understand the structure. Now, the most important aspect of the alveoli is that they are only 1 cell layer thick. They're really skinny. Why? Because again, if you're going to have diffusion occurring here, you don't want to have to diffuse through multiple layers of cells. That would be inefficient. And so 1 cell layer thick is really all that you need. Now, something that is that thin is not going to stay open on its own very easily, especially in young children. And so there is a liquid called surfactant, which is a combination of a fat and a protein. Um, and what it does is it lowers the surface tension of water in the lungs, which helps to keep the alveoli inflated. Premature babies are one of the first things that happens when they're born is that the doctor or nurse, whoever it is, will actually insert a tube down their throats and spray surfactant in there because the surfactant in the lungs is one of the last things that is produced in a developing baby. And so preemies don't have that surfactant. As a matter of fact, when the triplets were born, Jack and Auden were fine, but the oldest, quote unquote, Stephen, both of his lungs collapsed when the first one collapsed on the night he was born, and the second one collapsed 3 nights later. And again, it was because they were born at 29 and a half weeks, which is only about 7 months. And so their lungs actually, his lungs actually collapsed. And what all they did was they cut little holes through his chest cavity, through his rib cage, just under his breast muscles, and they inserted a little pump and they pumped it up like a little bicycle pump, and they blew his lungs back up, and he's fine now. All right, you should hear him scream. In any event, so that brings us, my friends, to the end of the first video, essentially all of the anatomy in terms of the respiratory system. So stay tuned for the second video here, and I hope you learned something.